disabled. For attendees, we're just using it as a way to send PSAs basically out to you guys. If you have questions, and I really hope you do, please use the Q&A feature, and don't wait until the end to ask your questions. That's when we'll be answering them, but send them as you think of them and we will get to them. With that, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Allison McFarland, with a talk titled "Doing Good Even When No One Remembers Your Name, a look back at 19th century activist Frances Willard."
Thank you, Kelly. So it's my privilege to be able to speak and be a part of this session. I want to talk about Frances Willard, and if you don't know who Frances Willard is, then you are not alone. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see some information about Frances Willard. So Frances Willard was a 19th century activist. There are very few people who really knew much about her now, but at that point, she was very popular. And I want to just spend today doing a couple things. But here's a picture of Frances Willard, and it looks like she's there 1839 to 1898. If you can count, you realize she died fairly young. And this was my introduction to Frances Willard. I was going through some old books, and I came across this book that belonged to my grandmother titled "The Beautiful Life of Frances Willard." And it's filled with people writing about her after she died. And I was reading through some of these, and I actually thought, what woman alive today would garner this type of comments, these type of comments after you died? I was just so impressed the fact that I didn't know much about her and that everyone else seemed to think she was fantastic. So I picked up the book, started reading, and then read other books and turned into a research line for me. So you can see some of her contemporaries, who else was alive during this time. These are the ones you're probably most familiar with. So you can kind of get an idea of who she was hanging around with. So today, just in this brief amount of time, I want to give you a quick glimpse into the life of Frances Willard, just a little bit about her personal life, and then a little bit about her professional life. And I want to talk specifically about her role with the WCTU, her role in suffrage, her role as an orator, and how she chose to lead, all of which I think can be great lessons for us. So a few things about her personally. She's a Midwesterner, so I'm Skyping in from Zooming from Kansas, so I appreciate a Midwesterner. She was educated. Her father believed in education for her. She attended a college. She went on to was a dean, but we believe to be the first woman college president. So I also appreciated these descriptors of her: curious, ambitious, funny, planner, impatient, goal-oriented, leader, restless, stubborn. And I think some people who know me might say that some of these would reflect that they would use those to describe me as well. So I found a connection with her. She also was a devout Christian. She grew up in the Methodist Church, and someone wrote about her. It was her strong Christian faith that impelled her toward a life of active reform and gave her strength and determination to pursue such a life. Whereas several leading women's rights reformers denounced Christianity as an enslaving force, oppressing women and constricting their freedom. So she was unapologetically Christian and felt that that was the reason why she was doing a lot of her activity. She did die at age 59, and that's the age I am at the moment. So I think she died very young. And maybe when I show you some information, you'll understand maybe why her life was short. A little bit about her career. She was an educator. And as an educator, I can relate to that. She was the dean of the Women's College at Northwestern. This is as close as you can get to being a president of a college at that point. She did a lot of speaking. She did a lot of leadership when it came to women's leagues, especially in the Chicago area. Chautauqua assemblies, if you've done any research on that, to be a speaker there was quite a prominent assignment. She's probably best known for her presidency of the National Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU. A lot of folks who are younger than me would not know what the WCTU stands for, but almost every state still has a WCTU chapter. There's a national chapter as well. It's her role with the WCTU in which she did the following, which is just astounding. Authored 11 books, 33 pamphlets, 4 book chapters, 39 articles, traveled 15,000 to 20,000 miles a year, and her average yearly speaking engagements, 360. This is amazing to think about her doing this. I mean, she was just a prolific speaker primarily. She did write, she did recognize the fact that she was a speaker at heart. That's what her gifts were, but that she did write because she felt like she needed to. But at her heart, she would say, I'm an orator. So here's a pledge card for the WCTU, for those of you who aren't familiar with the WCTU. And it reads here, I hereby solemnly promise God, helping me, to abstain from all distilled, fermented, and malt liquors, including wine, beer, and cider, and to employ all proper means to discourage the use of and traffic in the same. So women would sign this pledge card, and this happens to be a copy of an old one. And this was not unusual that the WCTU was caring about alcohol. A lot of groups were concerned about the effect of alcohol on the family and the effect of alcohol on the economy. But this was one of their key issues, as evidenced by the term temperance. So here's a fascinating thing about the WCTU. This was no small organization. When Frances Willard took over, there were 2,000 people who were members. And by the time she stepped down, there were 250,000. And I think to myself, what organization today would have 250,000 women members? It's just amazing the ability she had to rally people around a cause, and people would follow her almost, I mean, they would follow her anywhere. There's a quote someone writes about, if Frances Willard put a plank out into the ocean and told us to walk on it, we would, because we trust her. She was a lobbyist. She did a lot of lobbying in Congress for things related to women's rights. And I'll show you in a minute what the specific things she did. So it's interesting that most people would say that the WCTU didn't grow in popularity, but Frances Willard did. And so because people loved Frances Willard, the WCTU became a huge factor in the United States. So as we mentioned, temperance was a big issue, prohibition related to alcohol. But the other thing that I found was interesting, and I'm just going to let you take a chance to read through this a little bit. Frances Willard had what she called a do everything platform. And in this, she said, it's not just about temperance. She cared about social reform, and every single one of these things she pushed for, everything from prison reforms, rape laws, physical fitness, retirement insurance. This is huge. So you're starting to see maybe why Frances Willard died at age 59. She cared about everything, and she cared enough to speak about everything. She was trying to rally women around these issues and get them moving forward so that they could help change their society. So animal rights, kindergarten for children, obscenity, she did it all. And that her pledge was called Do Everything, and she did. I think as a surprise to most people, Frances Willard played a key role in suffrage, and not many folks, I would say very rarely gets a mention when we talk about women's suffrage. Here in Kansas, we just had an anniversary of women's suffrage in Kansas, and not a single mention of Frances Willard. So it is interesting that the WCTU was not the first group to talk about suffrage. They came along after suffrage had begun and the fight for suffrage. But it is interesting that the suffrage movement had both men and women in leadership roles, and the WCTU was only females, right? They were a group of women governing and leading women. So here's the role of Frances Willard in suffrage. If you followed any kind of this research, you know that women who fought for suffrage were not necessarily viewed positively by culture, right? Suffrage leaders were often characterized as extreme and militant. And this is the difference that Frances Willard brought. So Frances Willard said to the WCTU, women, 250,000 of you, if you agree to vote, then you can vote for prohibition. So she made a plea to conservative women who had basically been alienated by suffrage leaders and said, you need to fight to vote, and you need to convince your husbands to fight to vote. So at this point, one of the most interesting things that I found was that people were now starting to, in this time period, connect with Frances Willard with suffrage. But Frances Willard paid a price for this. So she took about 5 years to convince the WCTU to endorse suffrage. And after she did, one of the folks with whom she worked said, You might have been a leader, but now you'll only be a scout. So she paid a heavy price by fighting for suffrage, but for her it was important because it was part of a social reform issue. This, probably out of the most interesting things I read about Frances Willard and suffrage, Susan B. Anthony, who we know and is often heralded as one of the suffrage leaders, introduced Frances Willard to the Senate Committee on Suffrage by stating this: "Gentlemen of the committee, here stands before you one who is commander-in-chief of an army of 250,000 women. It is said that women do not want to vote, but this woman has led the vast army to the ballot box or a wish to get there. I present to you Frances Willard." So Frances Willard collaborated with Susan B. Anthony and the suffrage leaders, and Frances Willard was able to bring the suffrage movement a group of women who the suffragettes had not yet been able to get. So I would love to see Frances Willard included in conversations about suffrage as we move forward. But she was certainly kind of, again, a person that you don't remember. One person wrote, "Frances Willard lifted suffrage out of the bog of contempt, a program into which the Eastern leaders had guilelessly steered it." What they're saying is that Frances Willard, for some reason, was not viewed as militant and defiant, and so people were willing to listen to her. So this leads to this issue about her as an orator. What was it about Frances Willard that allowed people to be interested in listening to her? How could she convince all these women to follow her? So I was interested to see what it was about her speaking. And here are the things that I found. She worked really hard to find what she called a public voice. So Frances Willard is not viewed as someone who said, here is what I'm like and take me or leave me. She worked hard to have a public persona separate from her own personal persona. She also made sure every time she spoke, she connected key issues with current events. Good, that's a good leader, right? A good speaker. She summarized her message with slogans. She was like the original marketer. She had fantastic titles and slogans that brought people in. She knew her audience before she went. If they were a group of faith-based people, she would integrate faith. If they were a group of either high or lower social class, she would talk about that, integrate that. She would integrate regional. She knew a Midwestern audience was different than an East Coast audience. She knew if her audience was educated or not educated. She did her homework, which contributed to the fact that she was such a popular speaker. The other thing that people write about her is that she also used what is referred to as a mixed style of address. That she was able to use what we often refer to as a masculine style of speaking and a feminine style of speaking. And there are lots of examples of this. So when she spoke to men, she spoke differently than when she spoke to women. So people write this about her as if, and contribute this to part of her success. So there have been a lot of interesting things written about Frances Willard. She's always referred to as a womanly woman, right? And that she promoted feminism. This makes sense because the 250,000 women who are part of the WCTU would only probably follow someone that presented that persona. So let me mention a couple things about her leadership and how she served as a leader. So we talked a little bit about her personal background, some about the WCTU, a little bit about how she was as a speaker. I want to talk a little bit about her leadership role, because clearly she had some skills here. So for those of you in management or teach management classes or serve in management roles, this is what we teach right now in management classes. She flattened the structure of the WCTU so that more middle management would have more authority. So she moved away from a centralized form of management into more delegation. She set up a system of regional and national mentors to train other women. Frances Willard was committed to women training women. And this was important for her, that you find the new young leaders and you help train them. She also believed in self-directed work teams. And that's a jargon right now in management. So she wanted people to be able to direct themselves. She did not want to tell them all what to do. This is a management style that worked really well for her with the WCTU. She did spend some time writing some manuals and some marketing plans so that there would be some consistency across different groups in different states. She worked really hard on public relations to try to not only connect with women, but also with men who were looking at the WCTU. Frances Willard was a networker, right? And this is not always a trait that women feel comfortable with, but she networked with other community leaders. She networked with the suffragettes. She networked with other women's groups. She knew how important it was to network, back in the day when they probably didn't even use that term. And she knew where her gifts were. She wanted to speak. She wanted to be the spokesperson for the WCTU and these issues. So she did a lot of delegating. She gave other people tasks so that she could go do what she was most trained to do. So looking at these, I just want to talk a little bit about her contribution, and I'm going to read just a couple quotes, because it wasn't really just about suffrage. It wasn't about prohibition. It wasn't about temperance. It was, I think, mostly about this. Someone writes, suffrage would have come in time anyway, and temperance was only indirectly affected by her efforts. But the broadness of women's advancement in America was conditioned by the magnificent work she did in arousing the mass of women to self-consciousness. This, then, was the greatest contribution Frances Willard made to her century and to her sex, to create the flood tide of a women's movement which should sweep aside restraints and barriers of seclusion or timidity and ignorance. She united womanhood for the benefit of women. The longer I studied Frances Willard, the more I read about Frances Willard. This is definitely, I think, her legacy, this issue of saying to women, you can be more, you can do more, you can find your gifts and develop those. If it's in the home, if it's in the workplace, it doesn't matter. It didn't matter to her. It was you find out who you are and what you can do and build on that. And I agree with this quote that this was her big contribution. Another wrote, she awakened people in thousands of cases to see what they might be, to believe in themselves and their own powers, not just blindly follow some leader, but to believe in what they themselves could accomplish. In most of Frances Willard's books, especially some of her smaller booklet books, she is trying to get women to believe in what they can do. It's amazing to look at this 100 years ago and see that someone was trying to get women like myself to say, you can be whatever you feel and you know are committed you can do. So I just wanted to bring to light what I think are some lessons that we can take from Frances Willard. And I put these under leadership lessons. After having, this is a concise kind of presentation, but I think after reading a lot of Frances Willard's documents, she would say, embrace your gifts, know what they are, embrace them. I think she would also say, embrace your faith, that you don't have to give up your faith to make a difference in the world, that should be your motivator behind what you do. She would definitely say to any of you who are speakers, know your audience, and writers too. Know who you're speaking to so that you can connect and make a better connection with them. I think in retrospect, Frances Willard would say, focus your efforts. There's a list of nearly 50 things that the WCTU did, and I think it was too much. And I think in retrospect, she would say, too much, right? We should have focused in on fewer things and tried to do them just a little bit better. I believe Frances Willard would encourage us to stay current with social and political issues and to, as a result, be a part of that. She was definitely current. She knew what was happening. She was big on networking, and she was definitely big on supporting other women. And we know that that's not always a strength of women, right? We don't always support each other. We don't always support verbally, let alone be a part of a group. She would say that's important, that we need to network and to be a part of other women's groups. I think in retrospect, I'm not sure if Frances Willard, I don't think she'd be happy that people don't know who she is, because I think you can't do that much speaking and not want the attention. But I think she would really want us to know the leaders that came before, right? That we can see that it's important for us to know so we can follow their path. I think in retrospect, she would say we need to maintain a work-life balance. She did not. I don't think she did, but she should have. And I think in retrospect, she'd say, I kind of like to live beyond age 59. There's 10 on this list. Here's number 9. She would definitely say, find those young women and encourage them so that they can move forward. And ironically, actually, I've done a presentation where I've compared Frances Willard to Sheryl Sandberg. She would say, lean in, be confident, lean in. So not only are these books similar, but look at their poses. They basically have the same pose 100 and some years later. Frances Willard is basically saying exactly what Sheryl Sandberg did in her 2013 book, which is both encouraging and discouraging that we're still having this conversation later. So as you move forward, I hope that you keep Frances Willard as a possibility of someone to research, to learn a little bit more about. I think she set a standard and we need to give her a little more credit and a little more attention down the road. So thank you so much for letting me share a little bit about Frances Willard. It's been my pleasure to be a part of this, and I hope that you add her name to your list of folks to learn more about.
Thank you, Allison. That was great. We already have also one great question in the Q&A, which we'll get to at the end of the session. Please, attendees, keep them coming. But next up, we have Amy Cohen with 19th Century America's Most Famous Philadelphian and Why You Haven't Heard of Her, the Anna E. Dickinson story.
Okay. Well, that was so interesting, Allison. And as you were speaking, I thought, well, goodness, they have so much in common. Frances Willard and Anna Elizabeth Dickinson must have known each other. And sure enough, I checked the one book that's been written about Anna Elizabeth Dickinson, and there were 11 references in the index to Frances Willard. So during the latter part of the 19th century, Philadelphia-born Anna Elizabeth Dickinson was one of the most famous women in the United States. Like me, she grew up in Center City, Philadelphia, in her case at 1710 Locust Street, and like me, attended Friends Select School. Though when she attended, the girls section of the school was located on 12th Street in this meeting house that was replaced by the iconic PSFS building in 1930. Dickinson's family was Quaker, and like her parents, she became an ardent abolitionist. An anti-slavery essay by Dickinson was published in William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator in 1856 when she was only 13 years old. In 1860, she began speaking out against slavery and in support of women's rights. Garrison and Lucretia Mott helped arrange major speaking engagements throughout the mid-Atlantic and New England states. Dickinson's charismatic delivery and provocative messages attracted thousands of ticket-paying spectators. In the Civil War years, Dickinson's speeches aroused enthusiasm for the Union cause. She visited hospitals and camps to lift the spirits of Union soldiers. Sharing a stage with Frederick Douglass, Dickinson gave a speech encouraging Black men to enlist and later visited United States colored troops at Camp William Penn. As her fame increased, Dickinson became known as the girl orator and the American Joan of Arc. As a national celebrity, office seekers sought out Dickinson's endorsement. In an era in which women were not expected to have a political voice, she stumped for radical Republican politicians before the 1863 Senate elections. In 1864, Dickinson was invited to speak at the US Capitol by nearly 100 Republican legislators. President Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, Union military leaders, and cabinet members were in attendance for this first ever congressional address by a woman. The 21-year-old Dickinson received a standing ovation. Although she had been critical of Lincoln in her speech for what she perceived as his lenient Reconstruction plans, she was later invited to the White House to meet with the president, further evidence of her national influence. I first learned about Dickinson when researching an article about the 1866 Southern Loyalist Convention, pictured here in front of Philadelphia's Union League. Dickinson and Frederick Douglass spoke out for voting rights for Black men, leading historian David Blight to conclude that momentum for the 15th Amendment was put in motion during this Republican gathering. As Douglas recounts in his memoir, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, after delegates from the Upper South thought the convention was over, the friends of what Douglass called manhood suffrage, quote, reorganized, elected the Honorable John Botts of Virginia president, discussed and passed resolutions in favor of enfranchising the freedmen, and thus placed the question before the country in such a manner that it could not be ignored. The delegates from the southern states were quite in earnest and bore themselves grandly in support of the measure. But the chief speakers and advocates of suffrage were Mr. Theodore Tilton and Miss Anna E. Dickinson. Following the Civil War, Dickinson became one of the most highly paid and most active speakers on the popular Lyceum circuit. In this 1873 Harper's Weekly cartoon entitled The Lyceum Committeeman's Dream, we can see that Susan B. Anthony to the far right and Elizabeth Cady Stanton to her left are the only women represented. When Dickinson took the stage, Reconstruction, economic inequality, and African-American and women's rights were among her frequent topics. Her popularity was so great that she earned the equivalent of $300,000 a year as a professional orator during a time when women rarely spoke in public. Mark Twain, a very popular Lyceum speaker, depicted here between the women, said the following of Dickinson. Quote, she talks fast, uses no notes whatever, never hesitates for a word, always gets the right word in the right place, and has the most perfect confidence in herself. Indeed, her sentences are remarkably smoothly woven and felicitous. Her vim, her energy, her determined look, her tremendous earnestness would compel the respect and the attention of an audience, even if she spoke in Chinese. In spite of her gender and youth, Dickinson continued to be sought out as a spokesperson by politicians. In 1872, she toured the country supporting the candidacy of Horace Greeley on the Liberal Republican ticket, much to the dismay of Republicans who had invited her to speak on behalf of President Grant's reelection. When lecture tours became less lucrative following the Panic of 1873, Dickinson wrote several books, including this memoir and What Answer?, a novel about interracial marriage. She published works of nonfiction about issues including education, prison reform, and women's rights. Dickinson also authored and acted in several original plays about historical figures such as Anne Boleyn and Mary Tudor. Courageously subverting gender roles, she played Hamlet on Broadway. Her likeness was licensed for use in a wide variety of advertisements. Throughout the 1860s and 70s, Dickinson was one of the nation's best known celebrities. People collected carte de visite of her image and paid handsomely for her autograph. Dickinson sat for the nation's leading photographers, including Matthew Brady, and I think we can see here what she considered to be her best side. Newspapers followed her career closely and also speculated about her romantic entanglements. Fame was certainly something Dickinson cultivated. In the early 1870s, she made headlines by being the first white woman to summit several peaks in Colorado. She was the second to successfully climb Pikes Peak. Notice whose visage is in the center of this 1870 print entitled Representative Women. This image was chosen by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton for their 1881 book on the history of women's suffrage. It's interesting that she signs, quote, "The world belongs to those who take it, though to my eyes, it appears to say, the world belongs to those who fake it. Which brings us to the question of why a woman once so famous and who lived to the age of 90 spent the final 4 decades of her life in obscurity. This marker in Goshen, New York, is the only public memorial for the moment to this once nationally celebrated woman. A combination of factors led to her downfall, and it is difficult to untangle the causes and the results of her demise. Picking up on the idea of the world belonging to those who fake it, Dickinson remained true to herself, which is perhaps why she lost so much. In spite of being asked repeatedly to take on a leadership position in the official women's suffrage organizations, Dickinson consistently demurred, preferring to represent her own views rather than those of a collective. Though she was pursued by many an eligible, prominent male suitor, Dickinson never married, and her correspondence indicates that she had love affairs with women, including Sally Ackley, a married woman with whom she lived, along with Ackley's husband, for over 40 years. Dickinson was litigious and combative. Lawsuits were covered salaciously in the press and dragged out for decades, costing her both money and friendships. She drank heavily and fell ill frequently. At one point, her own sister had her committed to the Danville State Hospital for the insane. In a subsequent court case, Dickinson represented herself. She also took her cause to the stage, which turned into a humiliating public failure. Her attempts to revive her earlier success as an orator also ended in disappointment. She was also, I would venture to guess, an early victim of the American fame machine, which to this day loves to build up the female ingenue only to watch with schadenfreude as the inevitable fall from grace occurs. To quote Billy Crudup in Apple TV's morning show, watching a beloved woman's breakdown is timeless American entertainment. Dismissiveness and resentment directed towards strong women who speak their minds is another challenge faced by Dickinson that persists to the current day. The court case in which Anna Dickinson sued her sister Susan and others for having her committed to an insane asylum was covered eagerly by the press. The following clippings come from an annotated scrapbook of nearly 200 pages, now in the possession of the Library of Congress, that Anna kept throughout the trial. Collectively, they create a picture of Anna's waning fame, her sharp intelligence, and her multiple struggles. I like how the word sensational is used here not once, but twice in the same sentence. I can't imagine she enjoyed being referred to as, quote, Anna Dickinson of old. After all, she was only 53 at the time of the trial and would live nearly another 40 years. Nor would she have enjoyed being referred to as, quote, once famous and brilliant. She was accused of everything from drinking too much to saying damn, to taking large quantities of stimulants. At least reviews of her performance were significantly better than those she received for her acting or playwriting. The trial resulted in a hung jury, and Dickinson announced she would try yet again to revive her speaking career. A window into Dickinson's rise and fall is also provided through a collection of letters archived at the Historical Library at Swarthmore College that I found on the In Her Own Right website. Philadelphia area educator Martha Schofield writes to an old friend in 1860 about her first experience seeing Dickinson speak. Last week, there was a lecture here by Annie E. Dickinson, a young girl not yet 18. Her subject was Woman in Her Position. It was very powerful, eloquent, and instructive. Most excellent for one so young in years. She has lately commenced, and it was a grand sight to see one so youthful, one whose eyes shone from the brightness of the soul within, speaking so well and pleading so thrillingly for the cause of humanity. In 1863, Dickinson's mentor, Lucretia Mott, celebrates her growing acclaim. How wonderful A.E. Dickinson's popularity. She has so much laid out for her this fall in this state. A few years later, Mott writes of her protege. Susan B. Anth said Anna E. Dickinson spoke grandly in Boston and very well at Longwood, too. Martha Schofield's uncle describes his fanboy feelings in an 1866 missive. How did thee know that I liked Anna E. Dickinson so well? Indeed, I feel proud to acknowledge that I do like her very much and had every speech she has ever made in my scrapbook, which I treasure very mightily. Thee mentions that thee knew her at 17 when she first spoke in public. In 1869, however, Schofield receives a letter from a friend's husband dissing both the message and the messenger. Will you tell me what you think of the criticism of Anna Dickinson's lecture? The criticism I like. The abstract I saw of her speech, I did not like. We have given the Negro a fair field and his full rights. Has he any right or cause with propriety to ask more for him? I think her pretty face has done more for her reputation than the quality of the matter she has doled out to the lecture-going public. By 1873, even Mott displays waning enthusiasm. You didn't miss so very much when Anna Dickinson lectured. She seems to be rather losing her radical ground of late. Anna Dickinson, the first woman to address both houses of Congress, should not, in my opinion, be so easily forgotten. In December, I submitted an application for a state historical marker for her original home at 1710 Locust. I am delighted to say that I found out during the first days of Women's History Month that the application was accepted. I have not yet made any decisions about when the marker dedication will take place or who will be involved, but if you would like me to keep you posted, please send an email to me at that email address. And I'm sure you can reach me through In Her Own Right as well. And I'll just close with saying yesterday, an article that I wrote about Anna E. Dickinson was published in Hidden City. To be honest, the article is very, very similar to what you just heard, but if you are now fascinated by Anna E. Dickinson and can't wait to tell others in your circle about her, please go ahead and forward that article to them. And with that, I really thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Amy. I definitely think I've developed some fangirl feelings for Anna Dickinson, so please invite me at least. All right, our final speakers, multiple, are Naomi Watkins and Michael Ramon Aguilar, speaking on A Matter of Trust, Dr. Martha Hughes Canon.
Good afternoon, everyone, from beautiful Salt Lake City, Utah. My name is Michael Aguilar, and I'm joined here with my colleague, Dr. Naomi Watkins, to speak a little today about a really remarkable woman and project that we both work on, and that is the This Is Her Place podcast. And we're going to have the opportunity to discuss Dr. Martha Hughes Canon. So This Is Her Place podcast tells the remarkable stories of Utah women, both past and present. We're actually getting ready to launch our second season just next week, where we actually, our first episode is on the first female governor of Utah, Governor Olene Walker, and our current lieutenant governor of Utah, Lieutenant Governor Deidre Henderson. These women have lived remarkable and inspiring lives, just like the women we featured across season 1 and who we will feature on season 2. And if you're interested, our website is thisisherplace.org, or you can find us anywhere you listen to podcasts. But today we're going to talk a little bit about Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon, who we featured on episode 2, A Matter of Trust from season 1. It was during episode 2 that we also highlighted the work of Dr. Annie Dodge Wanika, who was a tribal leader and a public health advocate who worked in the Navajo Nation in the mid-20th century, to Dr. Angela Dunn. And Angela Dunn is the Utah State epidemiologist who is currently on the front lines helping us and our state navigate the response to the coronavirus pandemic. Both of their stories are rather fascinating, and I would encourage you to listen to episode 2. But today our focus is on Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon. And you can probably tell that in all of our episodes, we've identified a common theme. And in this theme, it is that of public health. So if we go to the next slide, I'm excited to share, if you didn't know already, Utah has some exciting news. We have recently, we're all familiar with the anniversaries that we celebrated just this past year with regard to women's suffrage. And we're very excited that the state of Utah is sending this sculpture of Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon to the Capitol Statuary Museum. Now, if you recall, each state is allowed to send 2 statues to be represented in this museum. Currently, only 9 of those statues are of women. And so this is a big deal. And it's a big deal because this will be the first for Utah. And there are 4 in the works, so we'll actually be up to 13, and there's certainly more work that could be done when it comes to representation of women and their contributions in history. But the reason we did this and the reason that Utah focused on this is we really wanted to push public education around the contributions of women in Utah history and US history. And so it's a very exciting thing for the state of Utah, and it's something that we're continually invested in helping to make sure that we're educating the public. What's really fascinating about Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon, though, is that she is commonly known for her work as the first female senator. Naomi, if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, if you've heard of Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon, you're known for 2 things: that she was the first female state senator in US history, and that she beat her husband running for that seat. She was the lone woman elected. She was running as a Democrat, and that happened in 1896 when she served 1 term. And I want to point out this photo here. You can see that Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon is listed or shown there in that green oval among her colleagues, all of whom are white men. And you'll notice that there are 2 other women in that photo. Those women were actually assistants to the Senate body. This photo actually was taken about 3 to 4 blocks away from where I'm currently sitting in Salt Lake City. So it's really neat that I have a personal connection to the location of this photo. But there's Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon standing toe-to-toe to the Senate body of the state of Utah. What's really fascinating is that while she's commonly known for being the first female US senator in US history, and that she beat her husband for that job, what's interesting is that her descendants were unaware of that fact. In fact, Martha Hughes Cannon's oldest granddaughter had no idea that she served as a state senator. So I want to move on to the next slide. We had the opportunity to interview Constance Weber, who is she holds a Ph.D. in languages, and she kind of, in this interview, she discussed this very fascinating concept or knowledge that her descendants didn't have knowledge of her being a state senator. So I'm going to play a clip from our podcast next.
She said, I didn't know that till I read it in the obituary. I wish I would have known. I would have loved to have asked her about it. She knew she'd been a physician, and that was the profession that Maddie claimed as her main profession till she died. What was she? She was a physician.
She was very successful and impactful in her role as a state senator, but as you can hear, she was a physician. That's what she claimed to be. And how common were physicians, female physicians back then? Here's Constance Weber again on that from our podcast.
In the U.S., probably unlikely. In Utah, not so. Because of the men, the husbands of the founders, first of all, polygamy. So you had one husband often with a number of wives. And so many of the wives were very self-sufficient. And then the husbands were always being called on missions. And so Brigham Young himself said the women need to train to be physicians, to be lawyers, to take up the slack of some of these professions that the men couldn't fulfill because they were doing their church duty.
So I want to talk a little bit about Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon path to her medical career, but that starts with her at a young age. So you noticed that Constance Weber referred to Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon as Maddie. That was a common nickname that she had. Maddie was born in Wells in 1857, and she moved to the U.S. territory or the Utah territory in the United States, and around the age of 3. And it was then that when she was younger, her father passed, and her family stories attribute the passing of her father to her interest in medicine. And so at the young age of 16, she enrolled at the University of Deseret, which is now the University of Utah, and where she worked on completing her prerequisites or pre-med requisites, and where she also earned a degree in chemistry. And here you can see her diploma here, which is rather fascinating. Next, following this, Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon decides to attend college at the University of Michigan. And here's a picture of her diploma and her picture here. This is where she earns her medical degree. But what's really fascinating about this is that most women who are interested in the field of medicine or in health actually go to all women's schools. And here again, on this next slide, is Constance Weber speaking to that fact.
Most of the women, including the women in Utah who were already practicing medicine, went to Boston Women's Medical College. Maddie chose the University of Michigan, so it was an unusual path for her education. She practiced medicine to quite some acclaim for a short time in Algonac, Michigan. Then she went straight on to Philadelphia, where she attended the University of Philadelphia and the National School of Elocution and Oratory, which is a very important thing because she was training herself not to just be a physician, but to go on lecture tours to talk about medical issues. And at this point, because the curriculum at the University of Pennsylvania included hygiene, probably that course was one of the things she considered when she enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania. The course covered all the conditions pertinent to individual and public health, including the cause of epidemics, and the emphasis was on prevention.
She then went on to earn her degree in 1882 in pharmaceuticals at the University of Pennsylvania. And it's important to note that she was the only female student in her program. Here is a copy of that diploma. You heard Constance Weber mention her degree in oratory from the National School of Elocution and Oratory in Philadelphia, because what she wanted to do was she was so interested and committed to spreading knowledge on public health she didn't want just the knowledge that came with understanding the science of public health. She wanted the skill set to be able to deliver effectively that knowledge to the masses. And so this is a perfect combination. This is when she returns to Salt Lake City. And this is where Naomi, my colleague, Dr. Naomi Watkins, will take over to share some more of her interesting story.
So at age 25, Maddie has 5 degrees, which to me is like so amazing to have that many degrees at such a young age. And at that point, like Mike said, she returns home to Salt Lake City and she sets up her own medical practice. She's also the resident physician at Deseret Hospital in Salt Lake City, which even then was an all-women run hospital, which would be cool now to have an all-women's run hospital too. The board was made up entirely of women. And it is there at this hospital that she meets this prominent man in the community named Angus Cannon. And Maddie and Angus marry secretly, which I'll talk about in a second, and becomes his 4th polygamous wife. He eventually has 6. And they marry in 1884. And if you're familiar at all with any of the anti-polygamy resentment and sentiments, this is at the height of that they get married. So that's why they get married in secret, because they don't want anyone to know. Maddie's family doesn't even know until after the fact. And with this marriage, federal prosecutors are in Utah trying to prosecute polygamists, trying to put them into jail. The same is true with Angus Cannon. And Maddie, being a physician, is in this really interesting position because the courts want her to testify about the paternity of the children, of the babies that she's delivered as a way to prosecute polygamists. But not only that, she's obviously in this polygamous marriage. And so she and her young daughter, who's in this photo here, have to flee to England, back home where she's from originally, to escape this prosecution and to escape having to testify. We have letters between Martha and Angus during this time, and she's incredibly lonely. There she is. She can't talk about how she's, why she's there. So she's perceived as a single woman with a baby, which obviously was pretty shunned upon at the time. She's depressed during this, unable to practice medicine, but eventually is able to return to Utah and to Salt Lake in 1888. And she takes up her medical practice again and establishes a nursing school. Angus is actually prosecuted at this time and also put in jail when Maddie is in England. And in 1890, she gives birth to their 2nd child. So in 1890, at the same time that she's giving birth to her 2nd child, the LDS Church publicly denounces their practice of polygamy with what's called the Manifesto. And that then clears the path for Utah to get statehood. So in 1895, 1896, Utah finally gets statehood. And that is when Martha is able to run for Senate. Again, like Mike said, her husband is part of that. It's an open election. So they're not running head to head. There's just obviously all these seats that are open because it's a new Senate, and Maddie wins. So you can just imagine what the dinner conversation must have been like, her beating her husband in that election. And during her work as a state senator, she passes some really solid legislation. She's not just there to look pretty or to twiddle her thumbs during the legislative session. She passes bills that are still benefiting Utahns today. So she creates the Utah School for the Deaf and the Blind, which is still in existence. And she also establishes the Utah State Board of Health, which was one of the first state-sponsored boards of health in the nation. Utah State Board of Health, actually, their offices are located within the Martha Hughes Cannon building now. She also really cares about things like sanitation and clean air. Utah actually happens to have horrible air, so she would be really distraught that we're still dealing with that. But she passes also a law to make it so that the public can't drink out of a communal cup, which now just makes me shudder thinking about drinking out of a cup with anybody right now, especially during the pandemic. But she puts a stop to that type of common practice. So here is Constance Weber talking about that legislation.
And this, of course, was her greatest and most long-lasting achievement. It established a 7-member state board of health to which Maddie was then appointed. And the board was charged with the responsibility to encourage the establishment of local boards of health and to improve disease control, sanitation, and the water supply. They passed a resolution in the board to encourage, to advise the counties and the different cities to require children to be vaccinated. I think typhoid was the one at the time. And requiring in areas where typhoid was really a lot of cases, everyone to be vaccinated. They wanted to make it a requirement that they must do that, but they decided they could not. They weren't sure they had the authority to tell the counties and cities what they had to do. And furthermore, they said if we were to make it a law that everyone had to be vaccinated, there would probably be basically riots against it, because of course vaccinations were new. And this was at the very beginning of the State Board of Health being established. They knew that that was going to be a difficulty. And so they backpedaled and said, we advise it. Oh, these were the words. If we were to say they had to do it, we would expect a violent and determined opposition. That was their conclusion. Probably they were correct.
So here we are living through a pandemic. And Mike and I were laughing about this because our Utah legislature has decided that the state mask mandate will be over on April 10th. So, and we've been seeing these types of tussles between legislatures and people and public health officials trying to essentially do a dance, right? Between how do you educate the public, how do you do what is right based on data, and how do you make it so people are not rioting, or getting really upset about these proposed mandates. It's also a little discouraging that some things haven't changed. So after her one term in the state Senate, and she does a lot of work as well, but I want to talk about why only one term. So there was talk while Martha was a state senator that she would run for US Congress because she was such an effective legislator and so popular with the community. And so she, during her tenure as senator, gets pregnant again. And you have to remember, polygamy is supposedly not a thing anymore. It's not legal. And now there's actual evidence that she's in an unlawful relationship. And so that is quite scandalous. It puts an end to talk about her running for US Congress, puts an end to her political career. And she then returns to her medical practice and practicing medicine. Later in her life, she moves to Los Angeles to be closer to her adult children. And while there, she works at the University of California Graves Clinic and is really involved in the cause of eradicating tuberculosis, working as the vice president of the American Congress for Tuberculosis. So since we were doing this episode on public health and we're obviously living in this pandemic, and Martha Hughes Cannon was alive during the 1918 flu pandemic, we were curious as to her role in that pandemic work. And here is Constance Weber again, talking about her work there.
You have to understand, she graduated from medical school in 1880. Things were so rudimentary. Medical knowledge was about to explode, and she just missed it. Anthrax, rabies, tetanus, diphtheria, the medical use of x-rays, all that was after her training. So she was sort of in an in-between place for physicians. She didn't feel like she knew enough modern medicine to practice anymore. I think this is a lovely thing. Just before the close of World War I, the Spanish flu epidemic, right, echoes of today, she, like many other physicians, received a government appointment for overseas service to serve as a physician during this pandemic that killed over 50 million people. She never served, but she was so proud of her appointment, she kept that letter framed in her home for the rest of her life.
And I think about that letter being up on her wall and what Mike said earlier about how her family had no idea that she had been a state senator. Like, she obviously was really proud of her work, her medical work, and the work that she did there, and saw her Senate work, her Senate service, as being a means to educate the people to make laws that would support efforts of public health. So to close, when Maddie died, she actually made it so that, I don't know if that's the right way to say that, but she made it so that all of her papers were burned upon her death. So we're actually rather grateful that she was a state senator, because we have her words recorded in the things that in the bills and the speeches that she gave. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Martha Hughes Cannon's words. This is from one of her speeches. She said, "Let us not waste our talents in the cauldron of modern nothingness, but strive to become women of intellect and endeavor to do some little good while we live in this protracted gleam called life." And I would say that she did a lot more than just some little good. Her work is still felt here in Utah. And I think we have to give a lot of gratitude to our public health officials in the past and today, helping all of us get through this pandemic. So if you're interested, you can listen to the full episode with that little QR code. It'll take you right there. And with that, I guess we're done.
Thank you so much, Naomi and Michael. That was another great talk. And thanks again to all of our panelists for all 3 talks in this session. I really enjoyed them. And I'm excited now to jump into the Q&A period. Please keep sending your questions into the Q&A box. I guess I'll start with this one that came in during our first talk, a question for Allison. Elizabeth Griffith says, I thought the concern about the WCTU and suffrage was that any alliance with Temperance would bring the opposition of brewers, saloons, etc., as it did. And then kind of another question embedded in that, which is something I wondered, how did she manage 360 speeches a year?
Right. So 2 excellent questions, whether the second one is just a rhetoric or not. The first question, it was an uneasy alliance between the suffragettes and the WCTU. Even though they both wanted women to have the right to vote, they had 2 purposes, 2 completely different purposes for that. So I would say that, yes, there was concern about the alliance of the 2, but I think they came together to meet that common goal, even though they both knew that that final, the giving the women the right to vote would end up in maybe 2 divergent results. So there was collaboration, but it was cautious and uneasy. And the story about her speaking, there are records of her being on a train and just stopping at 4 or 5 places in one day, just nonstop. She'd speak, they'd drive, she'd speak, they'd get on the train, go more and speak. So yeah, I believe that number is probably accurate.
Okay, I want to jump in with a question because I'm a total methods dork. I just kind of want to know from all of you more about like your research process. Like what kind of like archival work did you do? What kind of sources did you look at? And like what was like most helpful for you in piecing together your stories and so on? Just kind of, I guess, give us all a sense of how the talks got made. Any of you in any order can pick that up.
Well, I can start. I mean, as I referenced, there is one book about Anna Dickinson. So that was obviously helpful. And when I went to apply for the historical marker, I contacted the author and he shared with me numerous images that were in the book and also let me use them for the Hidden City article. And I had already decided that I wanted, to do the historical marker and knew I'd write an article about Anna Dickinson when I saw the In Her Own Right proposal. And I was so happy to see that there were letters in the collection and those were really helpful to me. The newspaper clippings from Library of Congress. I mean, I have to say, like, unlike others here, I'm not university affiliated. I'm more of a, I guess, kind of amateur historian. So a lot of stuff that I find, I end up finding because I'm very visual. So when I kind of stumbled across that Library of Congress scrapbook because I was looking for images for the presentation. So, you know, not how you might want to be training your PhD students, but worked for me.
Well, Mike and I are laughing because we're not trained historians. So you know,
we're the amateur historian that Amy Cohen just
the
mentioned.
hobbyist. But so we do interview experts. So Constance interviewed a long time ago family members of Martha Hughes Cannon. And the fact that there are, you know, Martha had all of her papers burned, which makes me very curious, like what was in them that was like, so she didn't want other people to read. It's you know, using newspaper articles, and we're still uncovering stuff about Martha Hughes Cannon because now she's gotten so much attention. It's amazing how things kind of come to the surface, right? Like people like notice things. We found more pictures of her, which is really cool, I think, when that is happening. So I don't know if you want to.
We actually have a follow-up question to that in the chat box to panelists, which is Marjorie wants to know if Maddie gave a reason why she wanted her papers destroyed, which is kind of a, big.
No, she did not. That's why I'm saying I would love to know what's in them. So besides her speeches, the letters between her and Angus exist because at least the ones that Angus had. And that's how we know about her feelings about being exiled, right? She was not happy, which would make sense. But other than that, there's nothing that exists still.
So Kelly, in related to your question about methods, I was able to get a copy of all the books that Frances Willard wrote, which is 11, so it wasn't like it were hundreds. And then most of the articles and things that she has written, you know, The Wonder of Technology, the WCTU headquarters in Illinois also had a lot of things in their library. So that was kind of my start. Before I started reading about what people said about her, I tried to read what she had to say, and then I moved on and then ultimately compared her writing to the writing of Sheryl Sandberg, which was kind of my ultimate goal.
Thank you all. We just got a question in the Q&A, which is from Lois. So she says, I wrote a short piece about Anna Dickinson for the New York Times as part of Disunion, their commemoration of the Civil War. But I admit that Willard and Cannon were not women whose achievements I knew about until today. Thank you all for drawing attention to them. It strikes me that none of these three women were in, quote, traditional marriages, although two were in long-term relationships that were not monogamous. How can we position our understanding of their accomplishments in ways that honor how they defined their sexual and romantic pursuits or lack thereof? So I guess a couple of you could, well, all of you could probably answer that, but whoever wants to run with it, go for it.
So I'm curious, Kelly, can you ask the person who wrote the question, who they're referring to when they say that they know that they were in long-term relationships?
So I guess, so Cannon presumably is one of the women that's non-monogamous long-term relationship. Lois, do you want to kind of jump in and clarify? But while we're waiting for that,
I can ask Lois to come on verbally if that's helpful. Give me a second, I am doing that.
Can you hear me? The thing we've all been saying for the past year on Zoom. I think that Amy Cohen mentioned Anna Dickinson living for decades with a married couple and implying that she was in a relationship, at least with the woman in that couple, which I had not known. I'm a little mortified that I didn't know it. So that's part of what got me thinking about this across these three women. And I'm understanding correctly, Frances Willard was not married in a conventional marriage either. So it just struck me that this was an uncommon commonality, not that their relationships were the same, but that they were all doing their work and living their lives outside of the traditional definition of marriage.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Anna Dickinson, I think part of why her life kind of imploded was, you know, she was pursued by these men, but she was never equally interested. She ended up suing some because they were journalists. And, you know, in Matthew Gallman's book on her, he's really conservative about saying that she was in relationships with women because, as most of you probably know, 19th century women would write to each other with a level of affection and kind of a physical intimacy that we're not used to. But, you know, I would say her letters pretty clearly indicate that she was physically involved with these women. And then George Ackley, who was Sally Ackley's widower, he confirmed that Sally and Anna were in a romantic relationship. So, you know, as I said, life belongs to those who fake it. I think it was just part of her being such a unique woman trying to live on her own terms, which, you know, is still hard to do. And, you know, she ended up dying unknown and impoverished.
So Lois, thank you for the question and the clarification. I would agree with Amy that I think there's some, the issue of the culture of 19th century, how women's relationships, that's a part. Frances Willard never identified in any of her writing where she stood on sexuality. She was, however, engaged to be married at one point and broke it off. She did have very close relationships with women, including her assistant and people who traveled with her. You know, I think for a woman to not be in a marriage at that point, at least for Frances Willard, and then to be a leader of women who primarily were married, I think is a significant accomplishment for Frances Willard. Because even now, I think, especially among conservative women, to not be married is kind of suspect. So I think, you know, Frances Willard clearly was not married, but she led a group of women who were married. So we can't ignore the fact that there was this non-traditional role that she assumed.
So with Martha Hughes Cannon being in a polygamous marriage, you know, polygamy is the reason why Utah women get the vote taken away by US Congress. So, you know, outside of that Mormon community, definitely polygamy was seen as very suspect, horrible, evil, etc. But within her own community, she would have been very much lauded and very much respected. Maddie also had, you know, sometimes it's said that the sister wives would then take care of women's children as they went off to do work or go to medical school. We know that Maddie actually hired help. She didn't have her sister wives taking care of her children. She didn't necessarily have the best relationships with her sister wives. And I think, well, let me tell you about what happened when the statute was up for a vote, because the polygamy thing comes to a head again. So when the statute was being voted on by the Utah legislature, Utah currently has Brigham Young as one of our statues, which will probably be there forever. And Philo Farnsworth is the other guy who was the inventor of the television. And so Maddie will be replacing Philo Farnsworth. And when that statue was up for debate, Maddie's polygamy was like front and center. Like, how dare we send a polygamous woman to National Statuary Hall, which makes me chuckle because Brigham Young's like the grand poobah of polygamy. And it's okay that his statue is there, but it's not okay if we send this woman who was a polygamous wife. So a lot of people were upset about it. I think part of that is due to what I call polygamy shame in Utah. There's a lot of this like tendency to want to hide polygamy. People are embarrassed about it. But ultimately, right, Martha, I think, is not defined by her polygamous marriage. She obviously was so much more than just a polygamous wife, but I do think it adds an very complicated piece to her story, particularly as she's being exiled, being pulled away from the work that she loved. And we don't really know what Maddie thought about polygamy outside of those letters to Angus, which really were just filled about her anger for having to be abroad and mad at the people who are prosecuting them. So it wasn't necessarily about the relationship themselves. I think the fact that their relationship continues after polygamy is supposedly not practiced anymore, I think speaks to the health of their relationship.
So I kind of want to piggyback off of this point and ask about self-fashioning. So to a certain extent, like all of your historical actors, you know, had very kind of impactful opinions or tactics that they used to frame themselves either in their own time or for some potential future person who might encounter them. So I guess I would just invite you all to say a little bit more about like how the people that you're studying saw themselves and like the tension between how they wanted to be viewed, if that makes sense. Can I pick on people and just cold call them? I'd love to hear from Allison, who looks like she's smirking a little bit.
I'm just jotting down a quick note. So I think from what I could tell from reading about Frances Willard, I believe that Frances Willard became who she thought she needed to be in public, to be accepted, and to have people listen to her. And I don't think that's necessarily different than other women who grow up in a more conservative, faith-based background. I think, you know, she's describes herself as a feminine, well, she didn't describe herself as a feminine feminist, but I think that she was very concerned about how she portrayed herself, and it had to be very feminine, and that was important to her. So I think if you ask her now, I think, you know, she would say that she became who she needed to be in public to have her message be heard.
And I would say for Anna Dickinson, I mean, she was very aware of cultivating an image, very interested in being a celebrity and covered by the press. And really, it did strike me the degree to which she was a modern figure in terms of what happens to people who have early fame. I mean, she was famous as a teenager, and she was a has-been by 40. And she obviously cared. Like the fact that she kept this detailed scrapbook of her trial for, you know, suing her sister for committing her to an insane asylum. I mean, she cut out every article. A lot of them she would annotate and make comments on. So, you know, it just kind of struck me the cliche, there's no such thing as bad publicity. I think she, like now we're pretty familiar with the idea of what happens when people get early fame, but you know, if for her, she tried to control it, and when she couldn't control it, at least she savored it a bit. And just one final thought, which is that a number of her lawsuits were for like libel. They were for things that people said in the press that she said wasn't true. So she was very aware of you know, how she was seen by the public.
When it comes to Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon, while we probably won't ever know for sure how she tried to position herself with the way that people viewed her, I think that we would argue she wanted to be a change maker. And ever since she was young, she really positioned herself to be that change maker when it comes to the field of health and public health. And I think Naomi, this is best kind of like summed up in the quote that Naomi shared at the end of our slide that was, let us not waste our talents in the cauldron of modern nothingness, but strive to become women of intellect and endeavor to do some little good while we live in this protracted gleam called life. And I think that that best defines the path that Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon chose for herself. She wanted to make a difference, and she did.
Something that is so puzzling to me about her, though, is yeah, she's right in, with that. But if she was so concerned with those things, why didn't the family know that she was a state senator, right? Like, that's like so baffling to me. Like, do you think that she intentionally downplayed the political role and kind of, you know, put more attention to preserving her medical role instead, or was it just simply because it was a one-term thing and it was less of a professional identity for her? Something I found really interesting while you guys were talking.
I mean, of course, this is us speculating because we don't know, but I do think it's interesting, that story that we shared, and that she puts that frame certificate up on the wall. And I, you know, like that, to her, I think she was a doctor first. And then she like had this 4-year stint as a state senator, right? Which she saw as a tool to furthering her medical work. So that's my best guess, but I do think it is interesting that now the focus is on, at least in that public education campaign that happened last year, it was on her. It was a soundbite, right? Martha Hughes Cannon is the first female state senator in the United States. Something that people latch on to, and also the fact that she beat her husband is the thing that people latch on to because it's like this salacious, like interesting detail. But her being a doctor is not quite as sexy, I guess, to the public today. Like, female doctors are kind of a normal thing, which is great, right? Like that's what we want.
Okay, I'm gonna plea for more questions from the attendees. Please send them in. We have a few more minutes left before we wrap up. In the meantime, I guess one other thing that I want to know, you also all, through either the memorialization or the historical marker or through connections with like contemporary business education, had some kind of takeaway point about resonances for today. So what really are the big lessons you think that these examples hold for us today in all of your respective unique ways? Just as some final thoughts maybe as we wrap up.
I would, Kelly, if I could just, I think when I studied Frances Willard, I was struck and reminded by the fact that it really doesn't matter what you do or how you act or what you pursue, you will not have 100% endorsement, especially for women. I think women who act strong and powerful and go after things are viewed as being too assertive. And women who step back and are more passive are viewed as being too passive. So I think that Frances Willard, throughout her life, there were times when she was more forceful and women didn't like that. And then there were times where she stepped back and then other women didn't like that. So I would say, you just need to women need to just be who they are and claim their gifts and your personality that you've been given and go for what your goal is and not worry so much about what people think about you.
I would say that it's very clear that we can draw a parallel with the work of Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon around public health. And the quote in the presentation shared by Constance Weber that was basically, there will be all-out riots if we force people to get a vaccine. I'm summing that up, of course, in a less eloquent way. And that is very true today with what we're experiencing with the pandemic and trying to encourage people to wear face coverings, to distance themselves, to get vaccinated. And so what's this, my takeaway personally, is that we have a lot of work to do, and we have a lot of opportunity to carry on Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon's legacy of trying to educate the public around public health and the way that we can create a healthier environment for our communities. So I think there's a very clear and parallel there that we can learn from.
And I guess, thinking about Anna Dickinson, it just points out to me the kind of the randomness of who gets remembered. When I was a classroom teacher, which I was for many years, I used to always kind of start the year by explaining that history is not the past, it's an interpretation of the past. And the way we interpret the past often says more about us than it does about things that already happened. So we think that Anna Dickinson was the central image in that picture of representative women, that she was the photo for the image for the frontispiece of a history of American suffrage, and she became an obscure figure. Why is that? And I do think one main reason is that she didn't join the actual movement, but if a film had been made about her, if David Blight won a Pulitzer for writing about her, she would be so much better known. And this is kind of a Philadelphia reference, but Octavius Caddo, who was a 19th century civil rights leader, who 10 years ago was really, really obscure, in 2017, a monument was erected to him at our city hall. And, I've been kind of involved in Caddo stuff for a long time. And it, went from me saying to a group of people, has anyone ever heard of Octavius Caddo, and getting blank stares. And now it's kind of like, oh, there's a rally happening. We're meeting at the Caddo Monument. So I think that, that was kind of my reason for at least trying to get a historical marker.
Well, I think Allison just wrote it in the chat to us panelists, but Frances Willard's getting a statue going to National Statue Herald too. Is that correct, Allison?
So Frances Willard has already had a statue.
Oh, already had, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, now Martha and Frances can hang out.
That's right. That's right. But I think, related to Amy's point, if you ask most people from Illinois, who are your two statues in Statuary Hall, they would think it's Abe Lincoln, and he's not there. So it's Frances Willard. And again, who gets remembered? It's really a great question.
So we have our choice of statues, I guess, to meet at in real life in the after times. I think those are all great points to end this panel on. So I thank you all again for some really great talks. I really enjoyed them, and I definitely learned a lot. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Kelly.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.